The laughter came first, sharp, cutting, and meant to wound. A group of students clustered near the campus steps, their voices echoing in the open courtyard, their eyes fixed on the lone woman passing through. She walked slowly, her posture upright but weary, her frame draped in a faded green jacket that looked far too heavy for the spring air. The jacket was worn, its edges frayed, its fabric dulled by years of use. To them, it was nothing but an ugly relic, something unfashionable, out of place in a world that prized the new, the sleek, the trendy. "Nice jacket, Grandma," one of them called out, his words laced with mockery. Another snickered, adding, "Did you dig that out of a thrift store dumpster?" The group burst into laughter, feeding off each other's cruelty, emboldened by the woman's silence. She did not reply. Her eyes remained forward, steady. The old jacket clung to her like armor, and stitched into the fabric, faded but unmistakable, was a single patch, an emblem of a unit most would not recognize. Most, but not all. From the far end of the courtyard, a man in uniform had just stepped onto the pavement. His walk was brisk, his medals glinting in the morning light. He was a general, a man accustomed to silence when he entered a room, not because he demanded it, but because his presence commanded it. And as his eyes swept across the courtyard, they landed on that jacket, on that patch. In an instant, his stride faltered. He froze. The students' laughter still rang in the air, but he no longer heard it. His gaze had locked onto that emblem, and with it came memories that rushed like a flood. Dust, fire, night raids, and the haunting silence of battlefields where names were spoken in whispers only to be lost in gunfire seconds later. The woman continued walking, seemingly unaware of the storm. Her presence had just stirred in the heart of the general. To the students, she was no one, a relic, a target for mockery. To him, she was something else entirely. The woman's name was Elena. She was in her late 50s, though her lined face and tired eyes often led strangers to believe she was older. Every scar on her skin, every crease around her eyes, was the trace of a life lived through service, loss, and survival. The jacket she wore was older than most of the students mocking her. It had traveled through deserts and jungles, across oceans and continents. It had felt the weight of rain that smelled like gunpowder, of dust that carried the taste of fear. It was not simply a jacket, it was history stitched into cloth, memory woven into seams. Long ago, Alina had been a medic in the military. She had volunteered when she was barely older than the students who mocked her now. She had carried men twice her size through the mud, had pressed her trembling hands against wounds that gushed with life slipping away, had whispered to soldiers who begged not to die alone. Her hands had steadied rifles when there were no hands left to carry them. Her arms had carried the weight of bodies when stretchers ran out. She had seen comrades laugh in the evening and lie still by morning. She had listened to the desperate breaths of young soldiers whispering about home, about mothers, about the girls they loved. And when silence followed, she had closed their eyes and carried their names inside her, because someone had to. The patch on her jacket bore the insignia of a rescue unit that had been sent into one of the most brutal conflicts of their generation. That unit had been nearly erased, many never making it back, but Elena had survived, and survival came with its own kind of scars. Now, years later, life had grown quieter but lonelier. Civilian life was not kind to veterans like her. People didn't ask about her past, they only saw her present. A tired woman with an outdated jacket. A woman who didn't fit into polished offices, who didn't care for trends or appearances. She had grown accustomed to the sideways glances, the whispers, the dismissive laughter. But today, As the students jeered, the general's silence cut sharper than any insult they hurled. He remembered that patch. He remembered reports of the unit. He remembered the stories whispered among generals and soldiers alike about a medic who had carried more men out of hell than anyone had thought possible. A medic who never spoke of her deeds, who walked away with nothing but silence. He remembered a single phrase passed down through his ranks about her. She carried others so far, she forgot how to carry herself. And now here she was alone, mocked, invisible to the world she had given everything for. The general's jaw tightened as the students' laughter swelled. Their words clawed at her dignity, but Elena did not break stride. She walked with the same quiet endurance she had once walked with under skies filled with fire. The general began to move, slowly, deliberately, each step carrying the weight of revelation. The students were still laughing when his shadow fell across them. Their laughter faltered, not because they recognized him at first, but because his presence disrupted their bravado. They turned, their smirks fading as their eyes climbed the length of his decorated uniform. Silence rippled through them, awkward and uncertain. He said nothing at first. His gaze, hard as steel, swept over the group before returning to the woman in the jacket. Then, in a voice low but resonant, he spoke. "Do you even know what that patch means?" The students shifted uneasily. Their mocking confidence crumbled under the weight of his words. No one answered. He took a step closer, his voice rising not in anger, but in authority, in reverence. "That patch belongs to a unit that bled so others could live. It belongs to men and women who carried the broken, the dying, the hopeless through fire. And she—" His eyes softened as they fell on Elena, who had stopped and turned, her face unreadable. She was one of them. The courtyard fell into silence so heavy it pressed against the chest. The students looked at her again, but this time their eyes no longer saw an old jacket. They saw something they had been blind to, a story written in scars and stitches, a life heavier than their laughter could ever bear. Elena remained silent, her face calm, though her eyes glistened faintly in the sunlight. The general turned back to the students, his voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the last remnants of their arrogance. "You mocked what you cannot begin to comprehend. She has done more for this country in silence than you will ever do with all your voices raised." The words hung in the air, unshakable, undeniable. Elena said nothing. She never did. Her silence had always been her shield, her dignity, and now it became her victory. One of the students swallowed hard, shame burning across his face. Another shifted his gaze to the ground, unable to meet her eyes. The group dissolved into quiet, the arrogance stripped from them like a mask. The general stepped toward Elena. For a moment, the years between past and present blurred, and he saw not the weary woman before him, but the medic on the battlefield, the one who had carried others when all seemed lost. He raised his hand in a gesture of respect, a salute that carried the weight of memory, of gratitude, of reverence. And then, as if moved by something beyond themselves, the bystanders, students, staff, strangers who had paused to watch, began to rise. One by one, silently, they stood in respect, not for the jacket, not for the patch, but for the woman who wore it. Elena stood still, her hands by her sides, her breath steady. She did not ask for this. She did not seek it. But in that moment, she allowed herself a single thought. Perhaps silence can speak louder than any voice. The general's words lingered in the minds of all who had witnessed it. She has done more for this country in silence than you will ever do with all your voices raised. The students who had mocked her would remember that day for the rest of their lives, not as a day of laughter, but as the day they learned the cost of respect. And Elena, still silent, walked on, not triumphant, not bitter, simply steady as she had always been. Because her life had never been about recognition. It had always been about service. It had always been about carrying others, even when it meant carrying herself last.